Good morning, everyone. Thanks to all of you who are joining us in person, and I know that there are many multiples more joining us online today, and we're glad to have you joining us. My name is Dan Baer. I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy Research here at Carnegie, and I'm really excited to welcome you to today's event. It couldn't be more timely. Obviously, we've all followed with heartbreak the devastation of the two earthquakes that struck Turkey and Syria last month and the aftermath of those earthquakes, but there's also been a building political story in Turkey, one that perhaps was unexpected to a lot of people because we've become accustomed to accepting that political realities in a number of countries are permanent, and we are tempted by the idea that perhaps they are more dynamic than we once thought. And today's conversation will be an opportunity to dig into what the possibilities are for change in Turkey's political scene in the coming months. I want to take a moment to brag on Carnegie and just say that there are a number of countries that kind of are pivotal countries in the coming years for geopolitics, and Turkey is one of them. It lies at an interesting intersection. Those of you who have traveled there know that that intersection is visible when you're in Istanbul. It's a really pivotal state for the coming decade, and one of the things that I noticed when I was in government was that we had conversations about Turkey in a number of different policy discussions. In our Syria policy conversations, we talked about Turkey. In our refugees and migration policy conversations, we talked about Turkey. But there were rarely the focused conversations on what Turkey's future could be and what Turkey's future meant for America and for Europe and for the rest of the world. And I look forward to the conversation today being a chance to dig into those questions. We are really honored to have a fantastic panel. Carnegie has terrific expertise on Turkey, which you'll see in the form of Alper Coşkun, who leads our work on Turkey here in DC, and Sinan Ülgen, who's a colleague of ours in Europe. My colleague Sophia Besch, who will be commenting on why Turkey matters to Europe as well as the United States. And DAS Erika Olson from the State Department, who covers Turkey in her day job in addition to a number of other things. And I'm really glad to have my friend Ryan Heath, who has been with Politico in Europe and now is with Politico here in America as the moderator for today's discussion. We're going to start, because we've found that this works well for these kinds of conversations, we're going to start by laying the table with some facts for you so that we have some facts to chew on in the discussion. And for that, I'm going to welcome Sinan Ülgen.
The largest earthquake ever registered in Turkey, or in Türkiye, and it has affected about 11 provinces, in total 16% of the population. This is a region that is in Turkey's southeast, so essentially a neighbor to Syria. The number of casualties is rising. At the latest count, it was close to 45,000, but unfortunately, it will still go up. And the impact on it, the human suffering, the human impact is obviously very tragic. There's also an economic impact and a political impact, which we'll discuss a bit more during this panel. But economically, this is a region that represents about 10% of Turkey's GDP. Not all of the region has been affected in the same way. So this is more concentrated in Antakya, in the Hatay province, therefore, in Adıyaman and Malatya. But then there are, outer rings where this has also affected the whole environment. Now, when you look at that history of earthquakes, you see again here how big, how major this has been in Turkey's recent history. Before this one, we have two big ones that we recall. One of them, near Istanbul in '99, and I was living there at the time. which led to about a casualty number of about 17,000 people. And then way before, obviously I don't remember that, but in Erzincan with 32,000 people. But now this one, as I said, the casualties number I have already exceeded those two previous large earthquakes. And the reason for that is that that particular region is one where you have several fault lines coming together and energy building up. But obviously the reason why this number of casualties is so high, some of it has to do with the size of this natural disaster, but actually a lot of it has to do with shortcomings of governance, about lack of enforcement, about corruption at the local level and so on. So this is now the major theme that's being discussed in Turkey, and that's going to have a huge impact going forward on elections. But I'll stop here since we're going to talk more about the internal politics, and I certainly would like to welcome you as well. So thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. We should dive straight into it because we have a lot of ground to cover over the next 45 minutes or so, and I want to stress that we also want your questions. So if you put them through the system, I'll get them here on the iPad, and I'll bring you in as much as I possibly can. It's 100 years of the modern Turkish Republic, and there is a very big election coming up. It's not set, but it looks like it's going to be on May 14. And one sort of thought I wanted to sort of lay down before we go into the questions is that the situation around the election, you don't have an earthquake in Hungary, but this reminds me a bit of Hungary, where there is always a lot of hope that a coalition might emerge to challenge the government that has struggled or avoided some democratic responsibilities. And it may be a little bit different this time, but I want to make sure we ask some tough questions about how organized this opposition is and what the real prospects are around that election. So we will certainly get into that. I think that the right note to start on is if we turn to Deputy Assistant Secretary Olson first. Secretary Blinken recently made his first trip to Turkey, and it included meeting with President Erdoğan February 20. So maybe if you could characterize for us what the nature of the trip was and what you think the discussions signify now for the relationship going forward, Erika.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for inviting me here today. It's an honor to be with such distinguished panelists at such an important time when it comes to Turkey. And I want to start by offering my heartfelt condolences to the people of Turkey on what is really an unbelievably tragic situation. As you note, the Secretary Blinken was recently in Turkey. I had the opportunity to travel with him. We went to southern Turkey and we flew over Antakya and Hatay and the earthquake zone. And it really was just remarkable to see the impact and the devastation that the people of that region are dealing with. We also met with first responders, Turkish first responders, our own as well. I think, as you know, immediately following the earthquake, we sent about 200 people, including urban search and rescue teams from Los Angeles and Fairfax County, along with canines. The Secretary and I and others were able to sit down with those teams and talk with them about the efforts that they were undertaking. We also had the opportunity to meet with the White Helmets when we were in southern Turkey, and are working to support their efforts in Syria as well to help those impacted by the earthquake. A key component of our visit really was to show support for the people of Turkey at this absolutely devastating time, and to really clearly make the point that despite differences, when friends find themselves in their most difficult times, we're there for each other. And I think you've seen that throughout this tragedy when it comes to assistance We've pledged $185 million at this point. The Secretary, when he was in Turkey, offered another $100 million. We have sent millions of tons of humanitarian assistance. Our military presence, particularly at the base in Incirlik, has played a very important role. And I was able to see firsthand the 747s and jumbo jets coming from all across the world, landing at Izmir. Our teams were working hand in hand with Turkish representatives as well to unload those planes, to organize them in terms of the different types of humanitarian aid, and then the convoy of trucks that were just rolling into the base, being loaded up to go out to these communities. We also had about 15 helicopters that flew hundreds of sorties into those villages that were the hardest hit and the hardest to reach to deliver humanitarian assistance as well. And then, as the Secretary noted, this effort we know is not a short-term one, and that we're with the people of Turkey as they continue to deal with the aftermath and as they move towards rebuilding. Just yesterday, we handed over a surgical and trauma level mobile hospital from the U.S. military with help from USAID in Hatay, in the area hardest hit, to the Ministry of Health to run to help those people there. So the Secretary, of course, also met with President Erdoğan and with Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu while he was in Ankara. Those discussions really focused on how we could help following the earthquake. I think many of you have also noticed, and this was something we talked about, just how many different countries have come forward to help the people of Turkey, countries like Armenia and Greece and Israel. And I really sensed in our meetings a great appreciation, not just from the people, but from the government as well. So that really was the focus of our trip.
And given that it is such a strong show of support, do you think that seeds the ground for more effective cooperation in the more political sphere? Because it is a complicated relationship. We've seen that over the situation with Russia and Ukraine, and there's a new strategic mechanism bilaterally between the US and Turkey. So I wonder how you see that strategic mechanism working, and are there some good feelings there to make that work at a much more intense level in coming years?
Yeah, I mean, sure. And as you note, it is a complicated relationship, as many relationships are these days. I mean, Turkey has played a really important role in supporting Ukraine. And of course, we discussed the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which is so important in terms of moving resources and food, especially to the southern part of the world. But you mentioned the strategic mechanism, and as you know, that's something that President Biden and President Erdoğan agreed to as a way for us to get together and have conversations about those issues that we share real interest on, as well as to talk about maybe those areas that are a little more challenging. The strategic mechanism has now met 4 times. The most recent meeting actually was just in January when Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu came. And I think that it has proven to be a very useful tool for us to talk about these broader issues that we have shared concerns on. I mean, Ukraine and Russia, of course, is one, but there are many others. Libya, access to food, energy, climate, environment, diversification. There are so many different areas. So I feel like it's been a tool that has been quite helpful.
Mm-hmm. I want to bring you in, Alper. You've recently published a study with Sinan, actually, into foreign policy orientations and what the prospects are either under a continued Erdoğan administration after the election or if there is to be a change of government. What do you see as some of the big trends there? And how do you see the strategic mechanism working? How seriously is that being taken inside Turkey?
Yes, thank you. Sinan and I, as you mentioned, we conducted a study on the political orientation of the opposition in Turkey, and we did this through interviews with the foreign policy representatives of the opposition. And basically what came across in our study was an overriding coalescence among them, despite their different views on specific areas, that Turkish foreign policy, both in terms of the methodology in which it was conducted and in terms of the rhetoric and its practical application, had veered off course. And they believed overall, despite the fact that they all come from different backgrounds, these political parties, they believed that a course correction was necessary. And while saying that, they basically made 4 points. The first one was that the absence of clarity on Turkey's strategic orientation, they argued, led to confusion both in the West, where Turkey is a founding member of many European institutions, a NATO member, a candidate for EU membership in the EU, albeit with all the difficulties and everything, that it was portraying a confusing image there. But at the same time, it was doing the same thing, leading the same type of confusion in its engagement with countries like Russia. And that this act of, if you will, playing off both sides against one another was leading to a disarray in Turkey's strategic orientation, which was at the end not serving Turkey's interests well. So they believed that is one area that a course correction was necessary. And underlying themes within that was they argued that Turkish foreign policy under the AK Party regime, under President Erdoğan, particularly as of late, had become more ideologically motivated. And they exemplified this in the engagement that the AK Party administration in Turkey had with, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood in the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring. And a third element which they identified, which was an anathema to the traditional way of conducting foreign policy in Turkey, was that they viewed some of the activities of the Turkish foreign policy as meddling in the internal affairs of other governments. And an example that was given there was the idea of toppling the Assad regime in Syria. And again, that to them was something that at the end of the day backfired on Turkey's own interests. So they argued that in all of these areas there was a need for change. And finally, one point that they made overall, and that's something that I think the opposition platform now under the presidential candidate Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is using as a ticket in their campaign, is that the executive presidential system has created a way of conducting and devising policy in Turkey in a manner that basically sidelines the line ministries, that disallows them to make the input that they would traditionally have made, and which is why they are arguing that Turkey needs to go back to a parliamentary system. And so their point is that the foreign ministry needs to be given a more central role in the conduct of foreign policy. When you put all of these together, obviously, if the opposition were to win the elections, it's quite clear that you will see a change significantly both in the way in which foreign policy is conducted, but also in terms of the specific approaches to different matters. But this is not to say that long-standing issues will be resolved overnight, obviously. The strategic mechanism, I think, was an important investment in the relationship between Turkey and the United States that exemplifies the continuing interest on both sides to invest in the relationship. It hasn't solved anything, and Erika will know this better than I do, but at the end of the day, the fact that both sides, despite the difficulties, have put forward their shared wisdom of trying to talk through these matters, and maybe even more importantly, try and identify areas where there may be convergences of interest between Turkey and the United States, including new areas, not only in the energy realm, but possibly in Africa, that provides hope for the future.
Now, a job of any good opposition is to be critical of a government and to make a small target of itself. So that maybe explains why we don't know exactly what this new opposition coalition thinks on some of the key issues. But in practical terms, would it be fair to characterize this opposition coalition as more pro-US, like more willing to engage, more pro-Ukraine? And then the one I have the real question on is what they would do around Swedish NATO membership, which isn't clear to me, but I'm not the expert.
I think the most difficult question you ask is for me to characterize this table of 6, because they are such an odd mix of political parties coming from the widest spectrum of the political realities in Turkey that you can imagine, from the center left, the main opposition party that actually represents the Atatürk legacy in Turkey, hence secularism and the modern Turkish Republic as we know it, that is commemorating its centennial this year. And on the opposite end of that spectrum, you have the Saadet Partisi, which is the basically mainstream of the Islamist politics in Turkey. And then you have the splinter parties that used to be with Erdoğan, his ex-foreign minister, Davutoğlu, ex-prime minister, and then Ali Babacan. And you also have the E party, which is a center-right party that broke off from the MHP. So it's really an odd mix, but I think it depends on how you look at the matter. My perspective on this, that is a fantastic experiment in democracy. The fact that these parties are able to come together. When Kılıçdaroğlu's candidacy was announced by the table of six, after the short hiccup that they had over the weekend where E Party walked out from the table of six, it was very symbolic because this announcement was being made in front of the Saadet Partisi, this Islamist-leaning political party, and there were CHP supporters chanting Atatürk and pro-Republican sentiments there. And so it was really an interesting experiment. The resilience of this mixed batch, I think, will be the test, and that is probably Erdoğan will try and hone into going into the elections. But at the end of the day, I think the complexity of this mix and the experiment that comes out of it is an interesting experiment for Turkish politics, and it seems that the public at large has embraced this idea, so there's a positive aspect there.
Got it. And now, Sophia, before we get back into more of the election side of things and the earthquake, I wanted to ask you about this Turkish sort of ambiguity approach, splitting the difference between Ukraine and Russia, and how that's perceived by European NATO allies. They obviously have their own complicated relationship with Erdogan. We've seen that around migration, Syria, and other issues. So what can European allies do about their frustrations around Turkey's approach so far in the Russia war?
Thanks, that's an excellent question. So first of all, I know I'm supposed to speak for Europe on this panel, but
all of Europe. Just condense it immediately in 60 seconds.
I do just have to say at the outset that, of course, there are different voices in Europe. We have some countries like Greece and France that are a lot more vocal and hawkish on the issue of Turkey. But I do think that Europe is sort of united in a tacit understanding that while a difficult, complicated ally, Turkey's better in than out. We don't want to alienate the country, particularly not in the context of the war with Russia. I think there was initial hope, actually, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, that Turkey was maybe going to be able to play a sort of mediator role, and that it would distance itself more from Putin's Russia. And initially there were some signs. Erdogan has clearly condemned the invasion, which was appreciated by European allies. But as the war has gone on, as the scale of the atrocities has become clear, as a peaceful, mediated solution has become less and less likely, I think there's been some disappointment and some concern over the fact that Erdogan seems unwilling to distance himself from Putin. And that comes at a time when many European countries, are really undergoing a reckoning over their relationship with Russia and, sharing this sense of threat. And I think there is concern over what is seen as the sort of transactional, functional approach with Russia that doesn't quite fit into this idea of collective security, which Turkey is supposed to share in, right, as a NATO member. And the Finland-Sweden issue, I think, is a great representation of that very conflict, because the longer that goes on, the more it actually undermines alliance political cohesion, but also alliance security, right? And you ask...
And is that in any way tied to the election timeline, that he feels the need to look tough and that some of that might dissipate, or there's a way to work around some of this if he wins the election?
Right. So I think there's a wait-and-see approach in Europe right now. We have a pretty tight timeline with the elections and then the Vilnius summit in July, which I think if we're not able as NATO to announce Sweden and Finland joining in Vilnius, then that will be seen as a political failure for the alliance. It is undermining, it's sort of supporting Putin's narratives of a divided West, of a divided alliance. And it's also undermining defense planning, to defend the Baltic Sea security, we need Finland and Sweden in. So it's a really short timeline. You asked about what European allies can do, and I think that's the right question to ask, and it's a really hard question to answer, because we don't really seem to have much leverage because what we are able to offer, what Sweden has offered, doesn't seem to be enough. Now, there is this hope, as you say, that maybe that will change with the elections, that maybe the opposition would pick up on this issue and be a little bit more constructive. But right now, there's, I think, some consternation among European allies on this.
This is probably a good chance to bring you in, Sinan, and then broaden it out to these broader questions around the election. And when you talked about the transactional nature of Erdogan's relationship with Putin, it reminded me of the economic situation in Turkey, which is something any leader would have to be thinking about 6-7 weeks out from an election, where you've got inflation running at nearly 200%. And so I guess my question is, how much of this willingness to be a literal safe harbor for Russian money and assets and oligarch yachts even, and not be part of the sanctions regime, how much of that is a tactical necessity just because of all the problems in the economy, never mind the earthquake piling on top of it, and how much of it is an ideological strategic intent behind Erdogan's engagement?
It's a combination of the two. So the economy does play a role, especially going to elections. But I think even with a different government, Turkey's approach towards Russia would still be calibrated. There's a general understanding that Turkey cannot afford to be a Latvia when you look at our geography, in the sense that Turkey feels that it needs a degree of diplomatic engagement with Russia going forward particularly because of Syria, where through Russia, which is not Turkey's natural partner, but through Russia, Turkey was able to have a degree of stability in Syria, which ended refugee outflows. And that diplomatic partnership was then transposed to other crisis geographies like Nagorno-Karabakh, where Turkey and Russia worked together, even Libya. And interestingly, at the beginning, both in Libya, in Nagorno-Karabakh, but also in Syria, Turkey and Moscow were backing very different factions. Turkey was after regime change in Syria, Russia was backing the regime. Same in Libya. But ultimately, there is this modus vivendi, and I think there's a general acceptance that that needs to continue. However, what would change with regard to, if there's political change, is the nature of the relationship, because now this is very much driven by the political affinity of the two leaders, Putin and Erdogan, who seem to get along very well. That will change with the new Turkish leader. We wouldn't certainly expect the same type of chemistry. However, the overall state-to-state relationship, with Turkey not being part of the sanctions, I would argue would still continue.
Very interesting point. Thinking more generally then about the election, maybe I'll turn to you, Erika, not for political comment, but to check whether Secretary Blinken carried any messages in his trip around the elections. And the reason that comes to my mind is that Turkey wasn't invited to the first democracy summit back in 2021. So at some level, there must be a question in the back of the minds of people in the administration about the standards of democracy and the conduct of things like elections. So I just wonder if he had anything to say or any encouragement to offer to the government about how he would love to see the election sort of conducted.
Well, I think we have been consistent and are consistent across the globe about the importance of the free and fair conduct of elections when it comes to democracies. And as you know, the Democracy Summit was really put together as an effort for democracies, including us in the United States, to really reflect on the resilience of our democracies and think about what that looks like going forward, given the challenges of the modern world. I think that the message has been clear, I think, in Turkey about the importance of democracy, as many of you know who have spent time in Turkey, as I have. There really is a pride and deep belief in the day that you go to your balloting station to place your vote, that vote is going to count. And that's an important part of really the fabric of what is Turkey and modern Turkish political life. So I think our key message was, it's important to let elections happen in a free and fair way, and to let those who have put their names forward to compete.
And opening it up to all the other panelists, are there any red flags, concerns around the election, that it might not be conducted in a free and fair fashion?
I'll jump in. I think it's reasonable to have those concerns default, but at the end of the day, the probability of that actually taking place might increase in a scenario where the election results are tight. We've seen that in the municipal elections in Istanbul, where the result was quite tight, and a recount was initiated, and then those elections were canceled. But the effect was not as was expected by the AK Party government at the time, in which the initial winner, Ekrem İmamoğlu, who won with a small margin, eventually won with even a bigger margin. So that experience, I think, would lead everyone to be cautious. And I think you also have to bear in mind, traditionally, despite all of the democratic backslidings in Turkey, Turkey has had credible elections. And that is a legacy, and I agree with Erika said, that is a legacy. It's hard to measure that, but at the end of the day, for each and every Turkish citizen, irrespective of which walk of life they come from, that is a liberty that they find valuable. And we've seen this in the past, for example, after a military regime in Turkey, when Turkey was transitioning to democracy after the 1980s, the dictatorship at the time had pointed to a particular political movement for the electorate to vote for, and it totally backfired. So the idea that the elections can be stolen from the public is a far-fetched one. It's one that is debated and often comes to mind, but I see that probability as being very low in these circumstances.
Well, that brings us back to the harmony or the stability of the opposition coalition in a way then. So part of their ability to succeed in this election is going to be staying united or making sure they can bring the pro-Kurdish party into the tent either before or after the elections. What do you see as the prospects for that? And how has the earthquake upended those dynamics? Like, obviously things have been moving quite quickly and changing from day to day. So I don't expect that we can make big predictions, but you are the expert, so I turn to you for your thoughts.
No pressure, thank you. There's been some signaling in that regard recently. After the E-Party leader Akşener returned to the table of six, and Kılıçdaroğlu's name was announced as the presidential candidate, and this pro-Kurdish party, the HDP, is not currently part of the table of six. They had previously announced that they might have their own candidate for the presidential elections. But once Kılıçdaroğlu's name was announced, and that is a credible figure for the pro-Kurdish electorate, it is someone who they have signaled that they may vote for. After his name was agreed upon, the leadership of the pro-Kurdish HDP party declared that they would refrain, at least currently, from announcing their own candidate, and that their door was open, and that they would welcome a visit by Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. So they basically opened the door to cooperating, and they've signaled this in the past as well. The big challenge there has been how to bring the table of six, which incorporates the center-right E-Party that has kept a big distance with the HDP, how to incorporate that and build synergy. But on that front as well, I think Meral Akşener, the leader of the E-Party, has given an inherent blessing by stating very recently, after all these developments, that she would not be coming together with the HDP leadership and meeting with them, but this does not mean that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu cannot talk to them. So that in itself has opened the door for Kılıçdaroğlu as the presidential candidate and the leading force within this table of six to maybe have some conversations with the pro-Kurdish party. Sinan may have additional comments on this because I picked up on some of the news he brought recently from Turkey. So with copyright rights.
Share it with us, Sinan.
Yeah. Well, when I look at Turkish politics today, first of all, after the political impact of the earthquake, and then the latest episode regarding the table of six with Akşener walking out, coming back, and them declaring a joint candidate, it looks like an Escher drawing. You know about Escher, right? This, with this, different blueprints of towers, people walking up all the time and never coming down, and and you try to think how that does happen. It's a bit like that for Turkish politics now, because the vote split today, and I'll tell you about the numbers that we have that I got last night, is 55% for the opposition, 45% for the government, the Erdoğan coalition. So the question is, how does Erdoğan get 50% plus one out of a potential pool of 45%? That's the Escher question. And how does the opposition, for the opposition, it's more traditional. How do they get 50 plus 1 out of a potential pool of 55? That's more, normal. And the answer to that is not impossible. Because for Erdoğan to get the, 50 plus 1 out of his potential pool of 45, what needs to happen is that he needs to mobilize all his grassroots, which he can do. He's been a very craftful and successful politician. And at the same time, make sure that the other constituency of 55, at least some of them, don't go out and vote. That's the recipe for victory for Erdoğan, as things stand. Now, how likely is that today? I would say very unlikely. So from my perspective, where I stand with the numbers that I have, and the last night's poll, the latest poll after the announcement of Kılıçdaroğlu as the candidate, shows a 8 to 16 point difference between Kılıçdaroğlu and Erdoğan. Now, why this margin? Because there are actually two questions. First, the 8-point difference is between Kılıçdaroğlu and Erdoğan, and the 16-point difference is between Kılıçdaroğlu and the two mayors, which are the most popular, actually, politicians in Turkey nowadays, the mayor of Istanbul and the mayor of Ankara, running together with Kılıçdaroğlu against Erdoğan. There, the split is 16 points, 58 to 42, 2 months, before elections. So that's it's going to be the most challenging election for Erdoğan of his political life. And it's difficult to see, at least for me. Of course, he's much smarter than me as a political person. Maybe he'll devise a method. But right now, it looks like the prospect of political change is indeed a strong
one. How much would you attribute that to economy versus earthquake versus ideological frustration at Erdoğan?
First of all, the underlying dynamic is about the economy. Stupid. As it's about that. It's like, so, and
I had a very cheap holiday in Turkey last summer as a result of the exchange rate. I need
That's
to admit that conflict of interest.
And the interesting thing is that a lot of that economic downturn is self-induced. It's policy mistakes. It's not something that's been, imposed on us. It's this very unorthodox policy of believing that interest rates drive inflation, and therefore, in order to lower inflation, you need to reduce interest rates, which is what they did, and they continue to do. So it is, for somebody who has watched Erdoğan operate over this past 2 decades, this is the self-destruct mode, because it's the economy that's bringing him down. Now, after that, and here perhaps a bit, you will see this in other countries as well, the aspect of political polarization that has been built over time is to some extent an advantage to the government because it consolidates their vote. But in times like this, it's an enormous disadvantage because it makes it impossible to steal the vote of the other in such polarized state of affairs. So that's why the transitions, the vote shifts are going to be very limited, and we're going to get stuck with what we have today, which is a political situation that favors the opposition. So it's a combination of all these factors.
We are getting some audience questions in, so I'm about to turn to them after just one more to Sophia. There is obviously a big overseas Turkish population, not only in Europe, but millions within Europe. We've seen Erdoğan campaign to those groups before. Do you expect them to play any particular role in the election outcomes? Have they been shaped by the experiences of the last year, for example?
It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure that I'm best placed to answer it since I'm
Fair enough, I won't press you.
of that diaspora. I do know that in my own country, in Germany, I think we have about 300 million Turks who are...
1,000.
1,000, sorry, Jesus. 1,000 Turks who are eligible to vote in Turkey.
It'd have a very big impact if it was 300 million.
I sound like a right-wing German politician. No, but
Or a Brexiter.
But there have been tensions in the past, and there's a visit that has been cancelled in January because between Scholz and Erdogan because of some of the messaging that came from Turkish diaspora in Berlin that was seen as problematic from a rule of law and human rights perspective. So it's always something that there is some tension over that. I do think that European governments have found a way to distance themselves and leave the Turkish electorate to vote in these elections. But it is a broader question of where are we in our relationship with Turkey as the European Union, right? We've talked about NATO, but I think the issue of rule of law, human rights, the stalled accession process, which has led to mistrust on both sides, huge frustrations on both sides. We really need to invest in that dynamic. Again, I think there's hope that maybe after these elections we could get to a better relationship. I think there's also, Europe has to look at itself, the EU has to look at what the policy that we have been driving when it comes to accession, which hasn't been successful at all, not with Turkey and not with other countries in our direct neighborhood. And I do think that there is a sense now, after the initial enthusiasm for more enlargement in the wake of the Russian invasion, and then the acknowledgement that, this is going to be a long and rocky road for those countries like Ukraine, like Georgia, we cannot risk going down that same path again with those countries. And I wonder if Turkey will be able to benefit from that rethinking on enlargement, the rethinking on how to engage neighboring partner countries, not just through the lens of accession, right? Whether we can be able to have more flexible partnerships with those countries, whether that's through the EPC, whether that's through a more diversified enlargement process.
That's exactly, I'm a neutral journalist, but I can only endorse what you're saying there, having worked inside the EU institutions and following this for years, where, for context, for anyone who doesn't follow those EU politics really closely, for a very long time, a lot of countries have been given hope, but not really specific plans and means. And even when they've met criteria, haven't been flagged on to the next stage of accession processes. And the EU was really found wanting when the so-called migration crisis began in 2015 and 2016. It needed Turkey, and it hadn't invested in that relationship. And the strategic shortcomings of that thinking were very evident for everyone over those couple of years. One question from the audience here is around, I'm sorry, I don't have the name of the person who asked it, but the question is around, if the opposition wins and there are 5 non-CHP leaders in the coalition, it would be expected that they would become vice presidents. Fair enough. But can Turkish democracy manage such an unwieldy arrangement? How would that actually work in practice? What would these vice presidents do? It's often said a vice president doesn't always have the biggest list of responsibilities, and then you split it 5 ways, and you have people with the capacity to cause a lot of trouble potentially for the new government as well. Any reactions from our Turkish panelists?
Well, I'll venture a guess. It's totally uncharted waters. Nobody has an answer to that, to tell you the truth. This is a very new phenomenon, and ultimately, yes, it's a very unwieldy setup. But they have to succeed. They will have 5 years, the mandate, and I think, and here I will reciprocate what Alper has said. I think after years of polarization, having a political governance where you have different shades of politics represented would be a good thing for Turkish democracy. It will soothe some of the difficulties that we have faced as society, where you have, an Islamist, a Republican, a center-right nationalist, and so on. So that setup, if it succeeds, will be good for Turkish democracy. Now, whether it will succeed, nobody knows, but they will need to try. And initially, and in any case, when you read their statement, the president-elect, if he's elected, Kılıçdaroğlu will have the authority, and the others will be consulted on key strategic decisions. However, there is nothing that says that it's going to be by unanimity, so there is nothing that insinuates that they will have voting power over those strategic decisions. And they might actually have, be in charge of line ministries as well. So we may end up with a vice president who's actually a foreign minister, but also vice president, not that he, but with just that portfolio. That's also likely to be the case. We shall see. Again, uncharted waters.
Alper, have you got any navigation for the uncharted waters?
I think one point I'd make is it's important to remember what has brought this juxtaposition of political parties together. It's their shared conviction that it's time to introduce political change. So they have that shared objective, which is why Meral Akşener, despite her disagreements, decided to come back to the table. So as long as that target prevails, and that is up until the elections, things should go fine under normal circumstances. After the elections, they will have a continuing shared objective, which they've announced, which is part 2 of that scenario, transitioning Turkey back to a parliamentary democracy as it used to be. So there they will have a continuing shared objective, which should continue to hold them together. But clearly, once the euphoria of the moment starts to dissipate and different interests start to clash, it will become increasingly difficult. And that's where I believe the grown-up nature or lack of Turkish politics will determine whether this experiment will be a success or not.
Now, one question I might sort of make a hybrid out of a question here and a thought I was having, and this was in relation to the role of identity in the election. So one of the dividing lines in the election, in Turkish politics for decades has been secular identity versus a more Islamic sense of political identity. What can we expect from Muslim leaders in throwing support behind Erdogan and making their voice known in the election? And then how much that kind of overlaps for me with questions of incumbency. Like this poll, 58-42 or 55-45, sounds great now. Lots of opposition leaders get boosts when they come into their position or before we get to the real hard moments of an election campaign. And then the power of incumbency gets thrown into the election, and you have institutional leaders and you have people worrying about sort of better the devil they know and so on. So I guess the question then is the identity and the incumbency and how that is brought together through Erdogan's Muslim identity. How much can we see that over the next 6 weeks?
I don't know if it's going to be an exact answer to your question, but for me, these elections are about 2 things. The first thing is the obvious one. It's whether 20-plus year rule under President Erdoğan and the AK Party will come to an end or continue. But the second related, and I think more important aspect of this election, which relates in some way to your question, is it is also an election about the vision that Erdoğan has governed the country with, his conservative values that he has increasingly made a part of Turkish life, and of the body politic, and of the way in which government institutions function. So what is at stake, in my view, in the elections, in the second part that I'm trying to allude to, is it's basically an election about the social contract between the state and the people. And that's where the earthquakes, in my opinion, kick in very significantly, because irrespective of your conservative leaning or whatever feeling you may have, the impact of the earthquakes, the severe underperformance of the government has debunked many things in Turkey, but first and foremost, the argumentation that was the centerpiece of the new Turkey that President Erdoğan and the AK Party were basically advertising going into the elections. And the manifestation of that new Turkey was the executive presidential system that was meant to provide and ensure efficient governance, but that all collapsed. And add on top of that the fact that...
And to get specific on that, but correct me if I'm misrepresenting it, centralized responses aren't always the best for disaster relief. You need localized responses. And organizations and processes that are infected by corruption can lead to very difficult outcomes, from we don't get tents to people who need them through to we have shoddy buildings that collapse in earthquakes. There's a full gamut of that. Is that what you're saying when you're talking about the problems of the executive presidency?
Absolutely. Both the fact that the government agencies were not able to show the right reflex in the most critical moments of the disaster, the first 48 hours, the fact that the military was not deployed as it should have been, and then ensuing problems, for example, with the Turkish Red Crescent. That has a very strong legacy in Turkey, but now that is being lambasted by everyone because it was selling tents, it was even selling blood that it received as donations. So these types of stories that are coming out, cronyism, the fact that a lot of the new buildings and new structures that, again, were being showcased as the modern new Turkey collapsed, are all signs that the building codes that were supposedly in place had not been implemented. And add on top of that, many pardons that were given to shoddy constructions. So I think it's a whole array of bad governance that has come quite blatantly into the scene, which is why Erdogan is trying to rise above that and set that aside by talking about how he will rebuild. The focus is not on what happened, but what will happen in the future.
We got a question from Maria Makoska from the Polish Embassy, and it's around the priorities of the new opposition coalition, specifically in terms of relations with the US. I think we sort of very briefly touched on it earlier on, but are there any comments from you, Sinan or Alper, that you want to elaborate on, or any expectations from Erika? I know it's a bit political, but you're welcome to jump in if you want.
Well, maybe I'll start. Again, based on the work that we did with Alper, there is a real willingness to have the strategic orientation towards the West. And part of that is to reset the relationship with the US. But on what grounds, right? When you look at the array of disagreements that Turkey has with the US, there are at least two that are tractable, and one is possibly more difficult, but which poisons the relationship. The first one is the S-400 question, where there is unanimity within the opposition that needs to be settled. So there is a willingness to approach this in a way that's different from the current government. When you read their common agenda that they announced at the end of January, there's even a reference to return to the F-35 program, which in itself speaks to that same, because you need to settle the S-400 before you can, return to the F-35. So that's on that. Secondly, on NATO and by extension the transatlantic dimension, there's a real willingness to demonstrate Turkey's allegiance and support to the alliance. However, there is also unanimity that the US relationship with the PKK offshoot of PYD is a very toxic issue. And there Turkey expects the US to change its stance. And that's across the board. It's a bipartisan position, which even with the new government, if the US does not change its stance, it's going to remain as a major issue.
Erika.
I think what I would say is that Turkey is an important NATO ally. All you have to do is look at the size and the map to understand why Turkey matters, and Turkey's going to continue to matter regardless of who's in leadership. And I think if you look at the U.S.-Turkey relationship over the decades, it has gone through multiple different leadership changes, different political beliefs in one side or the other, but throughout all of that, we have continued to cooperate, particularly on some of the issues that are most important when it comes to regional stability and security. And I don't see that changing. Now, that doesn't mean throughout, if you look through that same period of time, I think you'll always see that there's been challenging issues that we have to work through together, and we don't always come down on the same side. But I don't think that those alone define the relationship or the importance of the relationship, not just from a bilateral perspective, but from an alliance perspective as well.
I've got a question from the audience for you, actually. Not an easy one. It's from Alexandra El Gui from the Albright Stonebridge Group. And it's a question about where we stand on the fighter jet deal.
Sure. I mean, I think I can say, and President Biden has been very clear about this, the administration supports the modernization of Turkish F-16s. I think right now it's more clear than ever that the importance of the alliance and of our ability to be interoperable as we address threats to the alliance throughout the region, and being able to ensure that our NATO partners have fully functional air forces that can be part of air defense and security for Europe is essential. So the president has been very clear on that, and we continue to work with Turkey on that process.
We're almost at the end of the hour, about 5 minutes left. So just a couple of final questions. One is, I've been worried, as like millions of other people have been for a while, about the number of political prisoners or almost show trials that have occurred in Turkey over recent years and decades. So my question then is, I don't have a sense from the opposition coalition what they would do with all those intellectuals, journalists, executives, politicians who are currently in prison. Is that something that they have avoided talking about? Is there a policy approach to what would happen should they win the election?
I'm not aware of a conversation on those specific terms, but overall it's quite clear from the agenda that the Table of Six have laid out, and from the political statements that they're making in reaction to some of the actions that have been taken by the AK Party government, that a leading priority for them will be to focus on democratic standards in Turkey. They believe that, first and foremost, it's a requirement for Turkey itself, and they've made this point in the interviews that Sinan and I conducted with them in the context of Turkey's foreign relations as well, because the argument they are making there is, first of all, for example, in Turkey's interaction with the European Union and the stalled accession process, the lack of democratic standards and the regression that Turkey has witnessed in those areas has not served Turkey well, not only for its own interests and for the interests of its own society, but also for the interests of Turkey and its international relations. So I think you can expect a very forceful agenda on the part of the opposition, if they were to win the elections, to focus on enhancing standards in that regard. And by definition, that would imply that you would see developments in those areas as well.
Okay. And then one last question. This is a very difficult one to try and address, but because it's predictive. Yeah, that was the easy one. So I want to bring us back to the earthquake. And obviously everything we've seen in recent weeks has been devastating. But it's been a while since the Istanbul region had an earthquake as well. So we really can't rule out that a big one is coming for Istanbul. And the way the metro area of Istanbul has changed since the last earthquake is extraordinary. And I'm not telling any news to people who are from Turkey or who've been to Turkey. It's bigger than New York City in terms of population. And we're going to see some of the same problems that we have just seen around this earthquake if another one comes. Are there any lessons that we can already be learning, any funding we can already be applying as international partners to Turkey within governance structures of Turkey? Because it's going to be too late to think about this if the earthquake hits. And so sorry to have that negative note, but I want to make sure we're all aware and thinking about that.
This is so important that I'm going to turn to Sinan.
That's our relationship. Yeah, I think the elections, even these 2 months, will be very much affected, not only by what needs to be done for the disaster, regions, where certainly it's very, things have to be done at an accelerated pace to help the people there, but also what's going to be done, exactly to answer your question, in other metropolitan areas to enhance the resilience of Turkey's cities to new disasters, to new natural disasters. So there is going to be a race there for the vote between the government and the opposition that will be determined about what this type of political strategy, governance models, funding schemes, action plans that they will share with the electorate to prepare Istanbul particularly to the big earthquake. And there, you know, it's going to be, when you look in population terms, that race, that political communication over disaster preparedness and resilience will be vital, because ultimately, yes, the earthquake has affected the region, but there the population is 10%. Istanbul, Izmir, which is another one that's, you know, where this can happen, that's where we're talking about 30% of Turkey's population. So that debate will be much more crucial, politically speaking, and which is a good thing actually, because Turkey needs to change, absolutely. And we just can't rest on and forget what happened and wait until the next disaster hits.
Any final thoughts from other panelists? No, I think that is, I mean, it's not a great note to end on, but it's an important note to end on. So I want to thank you for all of your engagement during the course of the discussion. And to Sinan, Erika, Alper, Sophia, thank you so much. And of course, Dan, for arranging with his team for this whole event. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ryan.